Offspring of Incest. What's your story and how is your life? I was adopted when I was 2. I am extremely close to my parents. They never kept it a secret that I was adopted. It really was no big deal until I got into those angsty teenage years and felt like I wanted to find my real parents. When I was 12, I found a small safe in my parents' closet and tried to find out anything I could. I found some information such as my original last name, but that was about it. Fast forward to about 6 years ago, I developed a bunch of pretty serious illnesses and was curious to see if anything was due to my genetic makeup. I met with a social worker from the state that I live in and he facilitated getting some info for me. He offered me the opportunity to meet my bio mother. I declined. I received a packet with my medical information. It turns out that my birth mother claims that her brother is my bio dad. Every woman in my bio mom's family, grandmother, aunts, etc., had significant mental health issues and all of them had their bio children taken away due to serious neglect and alcoholism. So I don't drink. That kind of messed me up for a while and I felt a tremendous amount of shame. I asked my mom if she knew that I was potentially a product of brother-sister incest, and she said that they found out during the adoption phase. However, I was also told to take the information with a grain of salt since my birth mother apparently had a long history of mental illness. I don't think I will ever know for sure, but I try really hard not to think about it too much and focus on my great parents who loved me endlessly and gave me a truly terrific life. I still struggle with the possibility. It makes me feel kind of dirty. The only people that know are my parents and my husband. I secretly hope that my bio mom was making it up due to her illness. Don't feel dirty. After all humans on this planet came from thousands of years of God knows what kinds of relationships at the early stages. So most likely every person out there has had incest in their lineage. Some more recent. Some dating hundreds and thousands years ago. We are all related. So. My old neighbor was the product of a father raping his daughter. She had some cognitive impairment that seemed like early onset dementia. It was very slow to progress. Diabetes and tons of mental health issues, hoarding, schizophrenia, agoraphobia, just about everything imaginable. If it was a thing back then, she would have also been on the autism spectrum. She had 2 children herself, non-incest, that were profoundly mentally ill and also somewhat intellectually disabled. The son was a horribly abusive paranoid schizophrenic and the daughter was a hoarder. They were all living together off of disability. Police raided their home and found they were living in filth with the dead rotting bodies of their pets everywhere, and the entire building was condemned by the health department. The son and daughter, adults in their 50s, wandered off never to be found. Their mother became homeless and ended up in a state-run nursing home. We were her only visitors. Jesus frick. Your comment is the first one on here, as of my reading, and I think I'm done. Good night y'all. Peace and love. My parents are first cousins. I only got some hormonal problems but it's not too serious. It's really embarrassing. The younger ones in my family don't know it and neither do any of my friends. It would be horrible if they knew. A girl in my school once joked about my parents being cousins because I'm Middle Eastern and I nearly got a heart attack but I just laughed it off since I knew it was just a joke. I had a biology professor in college who said that first cousins having babies is safe. I never did bother to ask for sources or look it up myself to see if it is true, but I may have to now. He said he had researched it himself because you can never be sure in rural towns who is and isn't your cousin. My brother is my father. It's fricked up. My mother groomed him from a young age to be her perfect lover and they had me when he was 17 and she was 35. I grew up thinking he was my brother and that my dad had left the family, but I found out the truth when I walked in on my brother and mother having sex when I turned 14. I was absolutely horrified and I confronted them and they told me the truth. I felt betrayed and disgusted so that night I took my belongings and left home. Haven't spoken to them since. They were the only family I had since my mother also left her family and never spoke to them again at a young age. I'm 24 now. I work with 2 children who were born because of incest. The boy is microcephalic, small head, cerebral palsy, severe ADHD and developmental delay. He's almost a teenager but is as functional as a 6-year-old and is on a toddler education level. He will probably need care his whole life. His parents were uncle niece but his mom was delayed as well. The girl was born from a brother and sister. They have 4 kids total and she is the only one with issues. I swear she has Marfan syndrome. Her joints are incredibly loose and she has very long fingers and toes. Her brain isn't able to process light properly, so she's legally blind. She's also severely autistic, which is probably unrelated to her parents being siblings, but it actually benefits her because she's incredibly smart. She's 10 now and is learning to communicate well and is excelling in school these days. She's actually starting going to regular school now, in a special class because she's blind. But we have hopes that she will be able to go to the normal classes in a few years. She's still not potty trained, but that's expected when you have her level of autism and being blind. The worst thing I've ever seen as a pediatric CNA isn't the children from incest though. It's the children from parents who drank or did drugs while pregnant. Such beautiful children who would have been perfectly fine if their mothers hadn't put poison in their bodies. I work with children with special needs too. The ones that break my heart the most are those that are born from mothers who drank or did drugs whilst pregnant. So sad. Poor things. Never had a chance. I have some acquaintances. 2 Indian sisters, adopted by an American family when they were babies. Apparently they were the product of their uncle raping their mother. These girls grew up to be gorgeous geniuses, so it worked out okay for them. Well, technically it'd be their father raping their mother. Still fricked up though. I am not Offspring but was a teaching assistant at a private school for children that were either the public school system kicked out or could not handle. I'll never forget this girl. Her grandpa was her father. She was 19 or 20 and had to wear diapers all of the time. She suffered from severe autism and was the absolute sweetest girl. This was a couple of years ago, but if I remember correctly she was doing schoolwork at about a 2nd to 3rd grade level. The last day of school, her and almost all of the kids were so sad and did not want to leave for summer as we were pretty much the only steady constant figures they had. I actually ended up seeing her while I was walking home from work about a year after the school closed. She still remembered my name and gave me a big hug. I'll never forget it. You're good people. There was a woman in my pregnancy and infant loss group that had a really tragic case of accidental incest. We live in a town where there's a military base and soldiers from Great Britain often come and train there. Well, this woman met a soldier at the club one night and they hit it off and started seeing each other. They discovered they both had family from a little obscure town in England. She was born there and her mother brought her to Canada when the mom split up with the dad. She grows up not ever having contact with her father as a result. Anyhow, this girl ends up pregnant by this soldier and doesn't get proper prenatal care other than her anatomy scan at 18 weeks. When the baby was born, he had severe deformities and was lacking a bunch of his bones in his limbs. At Children's Hospital, they do a genetic workup on the parents and baby, and within a couple of days, the baby dies. The genetic counselor ended up contacting the lady and telling her she needed to come in for an appointment. She doesn't. It turns out that her and the soldier are half siblings and they both had a specific gene mutation that had been passed on to their baby, resulting in whatever disease caused him to not develop parts of his skeleton. In the course of a few days, she lost her baby, found out her boyfriend was actually her brother, and went off the deep end and started using all kinds of drugs. Listening to her story made me feel uncomfortable and physically sick. It was awful. I felt sorry for her but also felt disgusted, even though I knew it wasn't really her fault. Oh my god, that's such a tragic story. Wow. My parents are first cousins. They share the same grandfather. It's not weird at all in my family. It's talked about openly for as long as I can remember. I remember hearing stories about my mom and dad growing up a couple streets away from each other. My brother and I are not affected at all by them being first cousins. Just the divorce, alcohol and drug abuse growing up. Not me, but a kid in school that I work sub at occasionally. His mother is the direct product of incest. Her father raped his daughter, and he is an absolute delight, let me tell you. He spends most of his time in a special ed classroom with 3 or 4 other students, and he is always helping out his classmates and his teachers when he can. He saw me at a local event and wanted to introduce me to his mother. She's got no teeth, and just looks ragged and worn, but she is one of the sweetest people I've ever talked to. He'll be alright. I think he's being groomed to be a custodian or something. But it's nice to know that such horrible conditions don't have to define an individual. Being a custodian is a decent job. He could have a nice life doing that. I have 2 siblings-in-law, adopted, obviously, who are the product of incest. Both have mental deficiencies. One is in legal trouble relating to child P. The other has Prader-Willi syndrome, meaning they will eat anything and a huge amount, due to never ever feeling full. Neither will ever live completely independently. Off topic, but Prader-Willi is not something caused by incest, and the risk for it isn't increased by incest either. My mama is from a tiny town in the deep south, but contrary to popular belief, there was very little actual incest inbreeding going on, and trust me, I would know if there were. My relatives are vicious gossips. A couple of first cousin marriages, but even that was very rare. It used to be more common among upper class southerners. Think Ashley and Melanie from Gone with the Wind. But my mother's family are all dirt poor sharecroppers. There was no wealth to keep within the family. There is, however, one bizarre couple from my mother's hometown. A guy married his stepmother. Now, this would be merely questionable if she had, say, married his dad when he was 18 or older and a more or less independent adult. But no, she married his dad when he was like 8 or 9. Then like 10 years later his dad dies, and the stepson marries his stepmom. Then they had a couple of kids together. I always wondered what the dynamic was like in that family. Dad, mom is being so unfair. I know, she was like that to me when I was your age. My great-grandmother married her uncle. My grandma is an odd one. She would probably have been diagnosed with developmental disabilities had that been a thing in the 1930s. Hard to say if that's a result of the incest though. My great-uncle, grandma's brother, is normal and fine. In my mother's family, there was a lot of sexual abuse, especially from a stepfather. My mother is the oldest of 7 siblings. She has 2 full siblings, and the other siblings are clearly of another father. Trust me, they don't need a DNA test. For years there was a question of who fathered who, but now that everyone's an adult, their character, their traits, it's just too obvious who fathered who, because of how much sexual abuse went on. A lot of kids were born from those half-siblings. Considering the number of problems that range from physical abnormalities to mental disorders, I'm thoroughly convinced that at least some of these kids are a product of incest, and not all a matter of she whored around at 15 like they would lead you to believe. It isn't that far-fetched considering he did, in fact, rape some of them. One of these uncle cousins was feral. His mom was young, didn't know what she was doing with the baby, and left him in the crib all the time. He didn't get enough stimulation, no one talked to him, so he became feral. It's a sick situation. He's in his 40s now and can hardly carry on a conversation. He is a good guy but tends to fall for a lot of conspiracies and other nonsense. He's never had a career. He slurs his speech and can barely understand basic concepts. Out of everyone in the family, he is probably the best living example of how that family treats human life, like garbage. Basically, no one stepped in and fixed the problem. Thankfully my mother did not, to my knowledge, get abused by that man. Her little sister did, unfortunately, and my grandmother has since divorced him. These aren't rednecks, either. They live in New York in a suburban community. These aren't ghetto thugs. Needless to say, I stay far away from these people. My paternal great-grandparents were possibly second cousins, which is not that extreme, especially for early 20th century rural Tennessee. However, I found some amusing relationships through genealogy research. There was a huge amount of genealogy research done about my section of Tennessee, and I downloaded thousands of people into a program called Family Tree Maker. One feature of the program was that you could click on the names of 2 individuals, and it would tell you how they were related. I found it amusing that there were some people whose name I could click, and I was related to them 4 or 5 different ways. You were my second cousin and my half-third cousin once removed and my third cousin once removed and my double fifth cousin. So many family groups had married into each other over the course of a century in the same area. Over several years ago, lived in emergency housing project in a famous university town. 2 prostitutes were moved into the apartment below mine. They were sisters. One was 19, the other 15. Both were doing crack. The 15-year-old was, by then, 8 months pregnant. While there, She had the baby taken off her. We all thought because of the drugs. 8 months of sheer heck before they got evicted. I had to keep calling the police because of the drug-fueled violence. Attending officers were always unsympathetic. One point, I was even threatened with a ticket for wasting police time. I was given a whole load of crap from both the police and the housing people. 5 or so years later, a local police sergeant was convicted of raping his daughter and sentenced to 10 years. As I recall, the local paper published his picture. It was one of the officers I dealt with over these 2 girls. Then I recognized the family resemblance from the picture of the police sergeant to that of the 15-year-old girl. The paper also listed the rape crime that was consistent with the girl's arrival in the apartments. The news story also detailed a conspiracy within the local police, where the rapist sergeant was earlier caught in a supermarket taking upskirt photos of children. I crap you not. And it was kept under wraps directly by the police chief, and the sergeant was actually returned to his duties. After the girls were evicted, I was hounded by the housing people and the girls' drug dealing friends until I got my degree and got the frick out that place. Shortly before I left, I last saw the girls separatal occasions. The older sister was with some pikey thug with babies in tow. The younger girl was walking past me with a can of special brew, totally guant and lost. Frick Cambridge. Frick what they did to all their kids. Smug drug taking posh shoots and junkie trash. Put that frick pile in the rear view and moved across the planet. To be honest, I didn't consider myself a product of incest until I read the comments here. My parents are first cousins. I come from a country where that's normal and lived all my life in another country where it is the norm. I think I'm pretty normal, and my siblings too. We all ended up being atheists in a country where you can get killed for that. Smart and open-minded. So in the eyes of my culture, there's probably something wrong with us. I think first cousins only counts as incest in cultures areas where it is considered a societal taboo. If that's normal where you come from, then you wouldn't really feel any adverse consequences of being a child of incest. I just don't think cousins is the same hardline definition as siblings or parent-child, or even aunt or uncle-child. My parents are first cousins and I have 2 younger siblings. I've told close friends about that and their reactions were initially surprised but then very nonchalant about the whole thing. I used to tell some people about that as just a fact about myself. I didn't know the topic was taboo when I was younger because my parents didn't make it out to be taboo. But now I speak of it less and only tell people I'm comfortable telling. I like to think that I'm not defined by who my parents are, but rather that it's another part of my identity. Just like how I don't like seafood or that I like writing. My parents are cousins. I think genetics could get a little tricky, seeing as I'll probably be more at risk of things. When I was in the army, I knew a guy whose mother and father were first cousins. Dude was even from West Virginia and had a thick hillbilly accent. Everyone would call him inbred, but it never seemed to bother him, and he'd tell stories about fricking his cousins, but not his sister because she was too fat. I don't know how true it was, but he claimed his aunt had him up against a wall, grinding her butt into his dong until he came. Weird guy. Well, I made a Reddit account for this, and well, my life is pretty normal. My parents are first cousins and I really have nothing really wrong with me at the moment. But I am only 16, so who knows. I understand that incest limits the gene pool and whatever, but I don't really think incest is a bad thing. My parents' marriage was arranged when they were kids, and mine is almost confirmed to be with my first cousin as well. I live in a country where multiple generations marry cousins, have kids, who then marry their cousins like you. It causes serious mental and physical disabilities. I hate talking about it, but here we go. My grandparents on my father's side are first cousins. My father and all my uncles and aunts have their share of problems and all are a little off. Generally low IQ for most of them, but there are a few that are pretty smart and well off. We have a range of health problems which may be a result of this. Diabetes, heart failure, blood pressure, and cancer all run rampant through my father's side. There are, I believe, 11 aunts and uncles, unless I'm forgetting one, which is possible, and only 2 of them have no medical issues. It's hard to give out so many details and remain anonymous because of how fricked up my family tree is. I was adopted at birth because of the fricked up life my biological parents led. I have a lot of biological siblings and a few adoptive siblings. I knew mostly nothing of my biological siblings until I got older. In my teens, my adoptive family was actually one of my uncles from the incest line, who I call dad, rightfully so. I have blood pressure issues despite exercising and eating proper. I also have physical twitches that sometimes are uncontrollable. Some days are fine and I have none. Other days are embarrassing. Most of my biological siblings have kids that they can't afford or have lost to the state. Most of them will not work. 2 of my fully biological sisters have tried killing themselves numerous times, from taking meds to slashing their wrists. One of said sisters is an alcoholic. Hardest part to believe, I have unfortunately slept with one of my fully biological sisters. We knew when we did it. Both were drunk and didn't care. Years ago. I am mentally here for the most part, but things like the above statements are signs that I'm not. I have issues with depression and general coping issues when something major in life happens. My biological siblings are all the same way with depression and coping. I know it affects us mentally, and I'm sure it's not just coincidental the health problems we all seem to face. It doesn't help having a low IQ family, but adding incest to the mix really fricked us over. There are very few people that I know aside from family that actually know about any of this. I have 2 friends who know about my family history, my grandparents. The thing with my sister. I'm not a doctor and have no credentials to say so, but this reads more like mental illness runs in your family. Potentially not from the first cousin grandparents, but just in general. Mental illness is nothing to be ashamed of, regardless of if it was increased because of first cousin incest. My grandparents are first cousins. One of my aunts was born with some jaw malformation. Mom got fricked up knees and a hole in her heart. Everyone has mental problems and needs medication. I teach at a school where cousin marriage is a cultural norm. 1 or 2 generations and no real issues present. 5-6 generations and suddenly every second kid has some sort of terrible physical or mental handicap. Also, certain families have a disproportionately large number of students with intellectual disabilities. These families' family trees are poles. Whoa, no need to drag Poland into this. My parents were step siblings. They were raised together from young teenagers, but didn't have me until my mom was 28, I think. Anyway, my father robbed a convenience store while my mother was pregnant and was in jail for 4 years. He got out and they got back together. He did a bunch of H 6 months later and me and my mom found him dead. 6 months after that my mother dropped me off with some of her junkie friends and never came back. They left me at a church and eventually the police found me. My mother was found dead in her car from an overdose the next day. My grandmother swears she was murdered by the mob for threatening to inform on them about my father's death. I really have no idea, but I think it's her coping strategy. I was raised by my mother's mom and father's dad, and they were extremely normal college educated people. I've got a host of the mental issues my parents did, but I keep putting one foot in front of the other. Telling the story of my parents just sounds like it happened to somebody else now. I had a roommate whose parents were also step siblings. The way he told it was, imagine the Brady Bunch family except Jan and Peter fell in love and got married. His mom was the middle of 3 sisters. His dad the middle of 3 brothers. He said it made holidays easy as there was just the one extended family to visit. My sister-in-law is a French teacher in an area of Ontario that recently received a large influx of Muslim families. In Ontario, students learn French in elementary school. My sister-in-law was teaching her class elementary school French for aunt, uncle, cousin etc, and about half the class put up their hands, all recent immigrants. They wanted to know what word to use when your one parent is also the cousin of your other parent. They don't teach them those words anymore. If they're kids and immigrants, they might have mixed it because in some Asian cultures your parents' cousins are still considered your uncle aunt because they're that closely related. Many siblings don't move away from each other, and so when they have kids, their kids are like brother and sister. When people attribute mental health intellectual disability to incest, I think it is reasonable to consider that the incest may have been in part the result of one or both partners having mental health issues to begin with. I had a sexual relationship with my first cousin and ended up pregnant. I am on a throwaway and going to keep my details as anonymous as possible. I was in my teens. He was in his 20s. I was on birth control, the pill. and pretty much fell in love with my cousin. He was, and still is, the only person to ever make me feel aroused and attracted to. He's the only person I've had that strong connection with. I think about those months we were together often. I found out I was pregnant and I ended up saying it was another person's child, not to prevent myself the shame of people knowing I was having sex with my cousin, but to spare my child the shame of being an offspring of incest. Both my cousin and I are intelligent, and I have to say our child is ridiculously smart. Our child is great looking, with a wonderful and loving personality. There are not any genetic issues. My cousin is not in our lives. He went on to get married and does not desire children. No one knows or suspects, but our child looks more and more like my cousin as our child ages. So much that my aunt has to suspect. We have looked at my cousin's baby pictures together, and the cousin and our child are basically twins. But she has never said anything to me. I don't plan on ever telling our child, as I cannot see any benefit of him or her knowing. Everyone in my husband's family looks like someone in the extended family, and I mean exactly alike. His brother looks like his uncle. His cousin looks like an aunt. His sister looks like another aunt. His second cousin looks exactly like him. Some families just have strong genes, and after reading this thread it seems like cousins isn't such a big deal after all. Late to the party here, but my husband's parents are first cousins. Their moms are sisters. My husband is a little slower when it comes to communication with others, but he's the smartest person I've ever met. He also has some spine problems. Aside from that though, he seems fairly normal. His family is as normal and boring as it gets aside from the incest thing. My second cousin is adopted. His parents fostered him and were told he has cerebral palsy. Sometime in his teens they did some genetic testing for some reason, and it turns out his parents are father-daughter. They could tell by the percentage of the genes that are the same, I guess. Anyway, he's in a wheelchair and non-verbal. Well, not really the same thing, but worth mentioning. My mom and dad aren't genetically related, but were kinda childhood friends who eventually got married. When they were both teenagers, their pairs of parents each split up, and my mom's mom married my dad's dad. So I don't really have a traditional two sides of the family, but a weird tangle of marriage and divorce, and it's kinda hard to keep track of who is related to who by blood. Also, my parents only got married because they got pregnant with me. So I joke with them about how I am an incest-born bastard child. At least my parents and I have a sense of humor about it, but everyone else seems to ignore it entirely. Not true. Genetic incest, but my great-grandmother was adopted at age 4 and grew up to marry her adoptive brother. Obviously this doesn't cause any problems other than being weird to think about, but how I found out is kind of a funny story. Growing up I was always told I was part Native American because my great-great-grandmother was part of the Comanche tribe. Once when I was in my teens a relative mentioned that my great-grandmother was adopted. Of course, knowing that my great-grandmother was not the biological child of my Comanche great-great-grandmother, I felt I'd been lied to and that there was no way I was genetically part Native American. It was only then that I was informed that yes, she was my biological great-great-grandmother, but on my grandfather's paternal side. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.